Okay, so these are some of the rules that you want to avoid. Now, the rules on the right are to be not violated at all under any circumstances. The music theory police will throw you into music theory jail for these offenses right here. All right, these four you want to avoid, especially this first one. This is like the felony of music theory. So, of voice leading. You want to avoid parallel fifths, parallel octaves, and parallel unisons, which are basically just parallel octaves but smashed together, at all costs. No matter what, that's rule number one. No parallel fifths and no parallel octaves or unisons, right? The other thing you want to never do is double the leading tone of a scale. So if you're in the key of G major, the one note you're not allowed to double is the F sharp. If you're in the key of, B flat, minor, right? The one tone you're not allowed to double is the A natural. So just keep that in mind. The other thing you're not allowed to do is do not write pitches outside of the vocal range. So whatever the tessitura is, and it's in your book on page, let me see, on figure 9.19, if you need to reference it, this gives you the range. So you don't want to go below that B or above the A for a soprano. They can't sing it. It's going to sound terrible. Same with the alto. So you don't want to go below that F or above the D. For tenor, whatever this range is, and bass, same thing. You don't want to go above that C for the bass. All right? The voices just won't make it. And originally, this was all written for voice and singers, so to keep that in mind. Now, if you're writing for something else, obviously you don't want to breach that tessitura or range either. So if you're writing for a string quartet, you cannot make the violin part go below G. It's the lowest string, and you literally cannot play a note that's lower than that. So yeah, stuff like that. So stay within the range. So don't do any pitches that are outside of the vocal range. Again, page 203, figure 9.19. And then the other thing you want to do is avoid the melodic intervals of augmented 2 and augmented 4. That's not diminished fifth, mind you, even though I put the little tritone there to remind you. Augmented 4 in all voices, so avoid those. Now, that said, we have some other rules here that are okay to break. They're not going to throw you into music theory jail for doing these. You might get a ticket if you don't get away with it. So if there are no other options, these are rules that you want to follow, but if there are no other options, then you can break them. So the first one is avoid crossing voices unless it improves the voice leading. So you don't want to have the soprano singing B and the alto singing G, and then suddenly the soprano drops to like an F and the alto drops up to an A. So you don't want those voices to cross each other. Now, occasionally, if it is going to improve the voice leading using all of these other rules, then you can break it, all right? Also, the upper three voices should not exceed more than one octave. So between the tenor and the soprano in that chord, you don't want that to be more than an octave apart. Now, the bass can basically do anything it wants. The only rule is that it has to be less than 2 octaves below the tenor. So wherever the tenor is, right, it has to be within 2 octaves. But between the tenor and the soprano, so tenor, alto, and soprano, you want that voicing fairly tight. So that should be within an octave of each other. All right? The next one is do not overlap voices by more than a whole step beyond the previous chord. So basically what that means is if you've got 2 voices moving up, say it's soprano and alto, so the previous chord, we'll go back to our G and B. So the alto was singing G, the soprano was singing B, and the next chord, you don't want the alto to go up in range by more than a C, right? So you don't want it to pop up to D or something like that. If you need to go to D, pop it down below, all right? So you don't want it to go past the soprano voice of the previous chord. And same with the soprano, you don't want it to drop below that G in the next chord, all right? So that's another rule that you want to avoid. But again, sometimes you get into situations where there's no possible way to avoid it, and you've just got to suck it up and do it. So let's see. It's sort of like going through, when they've got a street all blocked off and there's just no other way around it, or into where you want to go, and you kind of have to, move a barrier. I'm sure none of you guys have ever done that before. I definitely have. All right, anyway, our next rule is do not move in the same direction to perfect intervals in the outer two voices. So what this means is in the outer two voices, you want to avoid moving them from, the outer two voices, so the bass and the soprano specifically, this applies to these two. If they are a perfect fifth apart, you don't want them to move to a perfect fourth apart, or a perfect octave, or a perfect unison, which would be impossible. But, so you don't want to do that between those two. Because it gives the idea that they're moving in parallel intervals, which is rule number one that you want to avoid. So it hints at it. Now again, if you can't avoid it, then you've got to suck it up and break that rule. All right. So the other thing is unequal fifths. So that means a parallel or a perfect fifth going to a diminished fifth, or a diminished fifth going to a perfect fifth, may be used sparingly. So this will show up occasionally, and it's okay. So it's still technically melodically moving in a tritone, which you kind of want to avoid. But if it's a diminished fifth and not an augmented fourth, it's okay. Also, beyond that, we have rule number 10, which is that a melodic augmented second and augmented fourth, right, same as here, are almost never found just like this, right? So they are very rare, once in a blue moon. But what you will find are a melodic descending diminished fifth, all right? It can appear in the bass quite often, but it will never appear in the soprano part, all right? So avoid it in the soprano part. And also you will see a diminished fourth as opposed to an augmented fourth. A diminished fourth can naturally appear in the harmonic minor scale, so that is allowed and it will pop up, but only if you're dealing in harmonic minor. So if you're in melodic minor or natural minor or major, no diminished fourths. But if you're in harmonic minor, it's okay. And then finally, our last rule is the leading tone should progress upward to the tonic when in the bass or the soprano. So if you have the leading tone, right, in the bass or the soprano, so the bottom or the top, you always want it to progress upwards to the tonic, right? It's got to arrive at the tonic. That's one rule. So wherever that leading tone is in the scale, so if you're in the key of D, that C sharp, if it's in the soprano or the bass, it's got to move to the C. That's its next step. So yeah, those are the rules of things to avoid, things you have to avoid, do not violate, okay to occasionally violate if it's necessary. And now we're going to work some of these examples I'll work the first example from 9.1, 9.2, and 9.3 so you can get an idea of how it works.